Her name was Clara Beaumont, and she was born into a world that had already decided her worth. She came into life on a gray February morning in 1861, in a one-room cabin on the edge of the Missouri River, where the wind never stopped howling and the walls never quite kept out the cold. Her mother died in that same bed 3 days later, leaving Clara in the arms of a father who looked at his newborn daughter and saw only one thing: a burden he had not asked for and did not know how to carry. From her very first breath, Clara existed at the edge of other people's plans. She was not hated, not exactly. She was simply overlooked. Ignored the way a cracked window is ignored, noted, tolerated, never repaired. By the time Clara was 7, her father had remarried a hard-faced woman named Dorothea, who brought with her 2 sons and a disposition as cold and efficient as a winter butcher. Dorothea did not beat Clara. She was cleverer than that. She simply redirected every ounce of warmth, every soft word, every extra piece of bread away from the girl and toward her own children. Clara learned early that love was a resource distributed by power, and she had none. She cooked before sunrise. She hauled water until her small fingers cracked and bled. She mended clothes by firelight while her stepbrothers slept. And through all of it she watched. She was always watching. Storing impressions the way a riverbank stores water. Quietly, completely, with tremendous pressure building beneath the surface. She was not without beauty. By 14, Clara had grown tall and lean, with dark copper hair and eyes the color of river ice, pale gray-blue, sharp and utterly unreadable. Boys on the frontier noticed her. Men too, which was far more dangerous. Her father noticed the noticing, and saw in it not a daughter to protect but a transaction to complete. Times were desperate. The farm was failing. There was a man named Douglas Holt who had money and land and who wanted a wife the way he wanted a good horse. Useful, obedient, not too expensive. She had been sold before she knew what selling was. The ceremony lasted 11 minutes. The bruises started on the 3rd night. Douglas Holt was 41 years old when he married Clara, who had just turned 16. He was not a man who announced his cruelty. He wore it quietly, the way some men wear pride, casually, always present, never justified. He owned a cattle operation near the Dakota Territory border, a sprawling, wind-blasted stretch of land that felt like the end of the world on good days and like a grave on bad ones. There were no neighbors within a half-day's ride. There was no one to hear anything, which suited Douglas perfectly. Clara quickly understood that the isolation was not accidental. It was architecture. He had built his life to make witnesses impossible. The first year was the worst because she still had hope. She kept thinking something would change. That he would soften. That she would find a way to manage him, the way you manage a difficult animal, with patience and the right kind of distance. But Douglas did not respond to patience. He responded to fear, and he cultivated it in her the way a farmer cultivates soil, methodically, seasonally, with an expert understanding of exactly how much pressure was needed. By the 2nd year, Clara had stopped hoping. She had started surviving instead, which is a different thing entirely. Surviving requires no faith in the future. It requires only the ability to make it through today and then tomorrow and then the day after that, with enough of yourself left intact to keep going. What Douglas could not take from her was her mind. In the long silences between his moods, Clara read everything she could find. Old newspapers. A battered Bible. A surveyor's manual she found wedged beneath a floorboard. She studied the land outside the window the way a prisoner studies the walls of a cell, not because she loved it but because she was memorizing the way out. She noticed the ridge lines. She noted where the creek bent. She watched the Lakota riders who occasionally appeared on the far hill at dusk, moving like smoke across the golden grass, and she felt something strange and frightening stir in her chest. Not fear. Something older than fear. Something that felt, against all reason, like recognition. The night Clara ran, the sky was moonless and the temperature had dropped to the kind of cold that makes breathing hurt. It was October of 1879, the 3rd autumn of her marriage, and something had happened that afternoon that crossed a line she had not known existed until it was already behind her. Douglas had gone further than before, not just in what he did but in what he said while he did it. There are certain words that cannot be taken back. Certain sentences that, once spoken aloud, change the shape of the air in a room permanently. When he was done and had gone to sleep in the way that men like him always sleep, easily, without guilt, the deep dreamless sleep of the uncomplicated conscience, Clara lay still for exactly 1 hour. Then she rose. She took her winter coat. She took a knife from the kitchen drawer. She took nothing else because she had nothing else that mattered. She walked out of the door and she did not look back. Not once. Not even for a second. She knew enough about the land to know she had to reach the creek and follow it north. The creek would keep her oriented. It would also cover her tracks in the morning when Douglas discovered she was gone, though she did not let herself think too far ahead about that. Thinking too far ahead was a luxury she could not afford. She moved through the dark grass with her arms out, feeling the cold air on her face like a second skin, and she focused entirely on each step. One foot, then the other. The dark was not frightening to her. She had lived in a kind of darkness for 3 years. The dark of the open prairie at least was honest. It hid nothing that wasn't already hidden. It made no promises it intended to break. By dawn she had covered nearly 9 miles. Her feet were soaked from crossing the creek twice, and the cold had moved from her skin into her bones, the deep kind of cold that makes your thoughts slow and heavy. She found a shallow hollow beneath a cottonwood tree and pressed herself into it, pulling her coat tight, trying to generate enough warmth to keep her mind working. She knew Douglas would ride out after her. He was not the kind of man who accepted loss. He would frame her disappearance not as her escape but as his theft, something taken from him, and he would want it returned. She had perhaps 4 hours before he was in the saddle. She was not running toward freedom. She was running toward survival. She did not yet know those could be the same thing. She slept for 2 hours, which was all she dared. When she woke the sun was up and the prairie was gold and brutal and beautiful, stretched out in every direction like something that didn't care whether she lived or died. She ate nothing, there was nothing to eat, and she stood up and she kept walking. North. Always north. She had no plan beyond distance. Put enough land between herself and that house and something would change. Something had to change. She believed this the way very desperate people believe things, not with confidence but with the ferocity of having no alternative. It was on the second afternoon that she saw the riders. 4 of them, moving in a loose line across the ridge above her. Lakota. She knew this because she had seen them before from the window of the farmhouse, and because she had read enough to recognize the horses, the riding style, the way they moved as a unit without appearing to communicate. Every instinct she had developed under Douglas's roof told her to hide, to press herself flat into the grass and go still. Those instincts had been trained by fear and they were powerful. But something else moved in her, something quieter and deeper and harder to name. She stood up. She raised both hands above her head, empty palms forward. She stood in the middle of the open plain and made herself visible, which was the most terrifying thing she had ever done. More terrifying than the night she ran. More terrifying than anything Douglas had ever done to her, because this was a terror of her own choosing. The riders stopped. For a long moment nothing happened. The wind moved through the grass. A hawk tilted on a thermal somewhere above. Then one of the riders broke from the group and walked his horse slowly, deliberately, down the ridge toward her. Clara did not move. She stood with her hands raised and her heart hammering and she watched him come, and as he drew closer she saw that he was not a young man. He rode with the particular stillness of someone who had learned that stillness was its own kind of authority. When he was 20 feet away he stopped his horse and looked at her. His eyes were black and completely calm. He did not reach for a weapon. He simply looked at her the way you look at something unexpected, with curiosity rather than alarm. His name, though she did not know it yet, was Chief Lakota Whitehorse. And the expression on his face in that moment was one she had not seen directed at herself in longer than she could remember. It was consideration. He was considering her as a person. As a thing that mattered. Lakota Whitehorse was 52 years old and had been chief of his band for nearly 20 years. He had outlasted wars, treaties, broken promises, and the slow grinding pressure of a world that was actively dismantling everything his people had built across centuries. He had watched the buffalo herds shrink from horizon spanning to nearly nothing. He had negotiated with American military officers who smiled with their mouths while their eyes calculated the price of his people's land. He had buried sons and grandfathers and held the hands of elders who died with grief more than age. He was not a man easily moved and he was not a man easily fooled. He had spent 5 decades learning to read people the way other men read weather, by small signs, by the way they held their bodies, by what their eyes did when they thought no one was watching. What he saw in Clara Beaumont, standing in the open grass with her hands raised and her lips pressed together in a line that was either courage or terror, probably both, was not a white settler woman who had stumbled into his territory. He saw the coat she wore, which was too large and had been repaired many times by different hands, none of them gentle. He saw the way she held herself, not with the openness of someone who felt safe but with the coiled caution of someone who had learned to take up as little space as possible. He saw the bruising along her jaw that she had not quite managed to conceal. He was a man who had seen great suffering in his life, and he recognized it instantly. Suffering has a posture. Survival has a face. She wore both. He spoke to her in Lakota first, calmly and without particular urgency, more to gauge her reaction than to be understood. She did not flinch. She held his gaze steadily and said in English, "I am not your enemy. I am running from my husband. You will come after me. I do not ask for much. I ask only not to be returned to him." Her voice was level. It did not shake. That steadiness told him more than any translation could. He had spent his life watching his people survive the unsurvivable. He knew what endurance looked like from the inside out. He made a decision in less than 30 seconds, which was not unusual for him. Leadership at his level did not leave space for long deliberation. He signaled to his men. One of them brought a spare horse. Dakota gestured toward it, and Clara, who had nothing left to lose and everything to gain, climbed onto the horse without hesitation. They rode north into the deep reservation land where Douglas Holt had neither the authority nor the nerve to follow. The other riders said nothing, but Clara felt their assessment pressing against her like weather. She sat straight. She did not look back. She had made a decision and she was holding to it with both hands, the way you hold to a rope over fast water. The village they came to was nothing like what the newspapers she had read described. There was warmth there and noise and the smell of cooking fires and cured leather. Children ran between the lodges. Horses stood in loose groups at the edge of the camp. Dogs barked and then settled. Women looked at her with the frank, measuring gaze of people who had learned that strangers often brought trouble and so evaluated every new arrival with precise attention. Clara felt the weight of their assessment, and she did not try to manage it. She simply sat still on the horse and let herself be seen. It felt strange. She had spent years making herself invisible. Being seen was almost painful, like light on eyes that had been too long in the dark. A woman named Winona took charge of her that first evening. Winona was the chief's sister, and she had all of Dakota's perceptiveness combined with a directness that Clara found immediately, surprisingly comforting. Winona spoke limited English but communicated with a precision that transcended language. She fed Clara. She gave her clean clothes. She indicated a sleeping space near the fire. She did not ask questions because she understood, as the chief did, as everyone who has ever helped a person in genuine crisis understands, that questions in that moment are cruelty wearing the mask of kindness. What Clara needed first was safety. Everything else could wait. That night, for the first time in 3 years, Clara Beaumont slept without listening for footsteps. She slept like a person who had, against all probability, reached solid ground. And in the morning she opened her eyes to a world that had changed while she was sleeping. Not the world outside, which was still the same cold Dakota sky, but the world inside her. Something in her chest had shifted. Something that had been braced against impact was, cautiously, beginning to release. Douglas Holt rode into the edge of Dakota's territory 12 days after Clara disappeared. He brought 2 men with him, hired hands named Reeves and Callahan, both large, both armed, both the kind of men who rented their loyalty at a competitive rate. Douglas had spent those 12 days in a state of cold, focused rage, which was his natural response to any loss of control. He had filed no official complaint. He had told no one the full truth of the situation. He had told the nearest settlement that his wife had gone wandering, and that he intended to retrieve her, and the men in that settlement had nodded with the particular sympathy reserved for husbands managing difficult wives, and Douglas had ridden north with the full confidence of a man who believed the law, the land, and God himself were arranged in his favor. He had been wrong about many things in his life, but this was the most consequential error he would ever make. When the 3 riders reached the boundary that Dakota's people maintained, marked by stones and cut poles that any experienced plainsman recognized as a territorial signal, they found 6 Lakota warriors waiting for them. Not aggressively. Not with weapons drawn. Simply waiting the way a wall waits. So, entirely present. Communicating through posture alone the fact that this was a threshold and it had not been opened for them. Douglas spoke loudly, the way men sometimes do when they feel their authority being questioned, as if volume can substitute for legitimacy. He said he had come for his wife. He said she was his property under law. He said he expected cooperation. The warriors said nothing. They did not need to. Dakota had anticipated this moment. He had prepared for it not with violence but with strategy, which was always his preference when strategy was available. He had spent 2 decades navigating the American legal and military system, and he knew its pressure points and its contradictions with the precision of a surgeon who has studied only one anatomy. Douglas Holt had ridden here expecting to collect property. He found instead a man who understood power better than he ever would. Dakota emerged from behind the line of warriors and walked forward alone to face Douglas. He was not in ceremonial dress. He wore simple working clothes and he carried no weapon that was visible, which was itself a statement. He had no need of weapons here. He looked up at Douglas on his horse with the particular calm of a man who has never needed height to feel tall. He spoke in English clearly and without haste. He said that the woman Douglas sought had come to his people of her own free will. He said she had asked for sanctuary and sanctuary had been given. He said that she was not a prisoner and not a slave and not a piece of land, she was a human being with the right to choose where she stood. He said that if Douglas wished to contest this through the legal authorities at Fort Pierre, he was welcome to attempt that path, though Lakota knew, and Douglas's face told him that Douglas also knew, that the American government had very little appetite at that moment for a conflict with the Lakota over one frontier woman with bruises on her face. Douglas sat on his horse for a long moment. His jaw worked. His hands tightened on the reins. His two hired men exchanged a glance that communicated, quite clearly, that neither of them was being paid enough for whatever this was becoming. And then something shifted in Douglas. Not a moral awakening, not remorse, nothing so generous as that. Simply the cold recognition that he had reached the limit of his leverage. He was a man who lived by control, and control for the first time in his life had moved completely beyond his reach. He looked at Lakota for a long hard moment. Then he turned his horse around. He rode south. He never returned. Clara, who had been watching from the ridge above the camp with Winona beside her, saw the three riders disappear into the southern distance and felt something so large move through her that she had to sit down in the grass. It was not joy, exactly. Joy is too light a word for what happens when a person realizes that their greatest fear has turned away and walked off the edge of their world. It was more like the feeling of setting down something very heavy that you have been carrying for so long you no longer notice the weight, and then noticing all at once, everything the weight had cost you. She did not cry. She had learned not to cry a long time ago, trained out of it by a man who interpreted tears as weakness and weakness as an invitation. But she sat in the grass on that ridge and she breathed, and the breathing felt different than it had before. Wider. More complete. As if her lungs had finally been permitted their full size. Winona sat beside her without speaking. After a while, she put her hand over Clara's hand on the grass. It was a small gesture, unremarkable by any measurement that matters to history. But Clara would remember it for the rest of her long life as the exact moment when she understood that she had not simply escaped. She had arrived somewhere. She was not merely the absence of a bad thing. She was becoming the presence of something new, something that had been waiting inside her through all those years of silence. Patient, intact, stubbornly alive. Clara stayed with Lakota's people through that first winter, and then through the spring, and then, slowly and without any single decisive moment, she stopped measuring her stay in seasons. She was not absorbed into the community the way a stone is absorbed into water. She remained herself, distinct, carrying her past with her the way everyone carries theirs. But she was accepted, and acceptance, for a woman who had been ignored by her father and owned by her husband, was a revolutionary experience. She learned the language in fragments first, then in larger pieces, with the diligent focus she had always applied to books. Language gave her access, and access gave her standing, and standing gave her something she had almost forgotten was possible, a voice that was listened to. Lakota himself became something she had no clean word for in either English or Lakota. He was not a romantic figure in her life, at least not at first. She had been too badly burned by the institution of partnership to approach it without caution. But he was a presence. A consistent, principled, entirely unpredictable presence who challenged her thinking regularly and respected her capacity to be challenged. He would bring her problems, disputes within the community, decisions about resources, questions about how to negotiate with the increasingly aggressive American agencies pushing at their borders, and he would listen to her responses with genuine attention. Not the performed attention of a man placating a woman. Real attention, the kind that is followed by action. He treated her mind as something valuable, which, after years of being treated as something decorative at best and disposable at worst, felt like water after drought. She became, over the following years, something the frontier had very little framework for, a woman who belonged to two worlds without being fully contained by either. She helped Lakota's people negotiate with government agents, translating not just language but intent, catching the fine print that men like Douglas Holt hoped would pass unnoticed. She wrote letters on behalf of the community that were clear, legally precise, and impossible to dismiss. She kept records. She documented grievances. She built, with the patient determination of someone who had learned that survival is a construction project, a paper trail of evidence that would eventually, decades later, support land claims that preserved a portion of what her adopted community was otherwise going to lose. She had been shaped by cruelty into someone the world could not easily break a second time. And she used every edge of that shape like a tool. In the spring of 1882, 2.5 years after she had arrived with nothing but a kitchen knife and the will to keep moving, Clara and Dakota were married in a ceremony that blended Lakota tradition with the practical legal requirements of the American system. Because Dakota understood, better than anyone, that love without legal protection on the frontier was a vulnerability, and he was done accepting vulnerabilities he could prevent. It was not a ceremony of fairy tales. It was a ceremony of two people who had both survived enormous things and chosen, with full knowledge of the cost, to build something together. The community gathered in the early morning light, and there was drumming, and there was the smell of sage and sweet grass on the wind, and Clara stood in her place and felt, for the first time in her life, that the ceremony she was participating in reflected who she actually was. Douglas Holt died of a fever in the winter of 1884, alone in his farmhouse on the edge of the territory, survived by no one who mourned him. Clara learned of this from a traveling trader who passed through the camp and mentioned it the way you mention weather, as information without weight. She received it the same way. She did not feel triumph. She did not feel grief. She felt, if anything, the quiet finality of a door closing in a room she had already left and never intended to re-enter. She was 33 years old. She had a husband who loved her mind as much as her presence. She had a community that trusted her. She had work that mattered. She had, improbably and completely, a life. Years later, when a young journalist came through the territory collecting stories for an Eastern newspaper and heard rumors of a white woman who had become a central figure in the Lakota community, he sought her out expecting something dramatic. A tale of captivity, perhaps, or of conversion, the kind of story that sold newspapers with its foreignness. What he found instead was a woman in her 50s with silver-streaked hair and steady hands and the particular quality of attention that belongs only to people who have learned, through hard experience, exactly how much everything costs. She sat with him for 2 hours and told him her story plainly, without embellishment, without the performance of trauma that audiences expected. When he asked her what she wanted readers to understand, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said this: "I was given a life I did not choose. I survived it long enough to find a life I did. That is not a miracle. That is what happens when someone decides to keep going and someone else decides to see them." She gestured toward the open land beyond the camp, the wide Dakota sky pressing down on the golden grass, and the journalist followed her gaze and saw what she saw: not wilderness, not frontier, not the backdrop of conquest and loss that it had become in the national imagination, but simply land. Old, patient, enduring land, which had been here before every story told about it and would be here long after every story was finished. Clara Beaumont Whitehorse lived until 1921, well into her 60s, long enough to see the world change around her multiple times over, always adapting, always watching, always the keeper of records that mattered and the voice that said what needed to be said. She left behind no fortune and no monument. She left behind something more durable than either, a community that was measurably more intact for her presence in it, and a story that proved, with the blunt force of a lived life, that fate is not a destination. It is a starting point. What you make of the road beyond it is entirely your own. Fate is not a destination. It is a starting point. What you make of the road beyond it is entirely your own.